Please give a warm welcome to our conversationalists this evening, Lisa, Romi, and Theaster.
Testing one, testing.
Are we good? All right,
Testing
yes,
one.
cool.
Hey everybody. How y'all doing?
And thank you so much for your radical hospitality, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, so we appreciate it. I think we said that we were just going to start off trying to understand this beautiful space that you've created, the sort of space for Black joy, for Black objects, for collective experience, and like, what is it? I think some people have been here, they know what the project is. Maybe some of you do not. Can you just tell us a little bit about this project and how it fits in with your practice?
Sure. So we call this building the Stony Island Arts Bank. It was a building that was about to be demolished maybe middle 2012, 2013. And when I found out that it was being demolished, I kind of wanted to halt the demolition, in part because it was the last of the big buildings on Stony Island, and all the work that I had been doing was on a couple blocks over in really small houses, and it was kind of illegal to do the things that we were starting to do. Illegal because they were residential buildings, not places of gathering. And so
that's the Dorchester project.
That's
yeah?
Dorchester. And so a couple days before the demolition, I had met the mayor of the city. He saw some projects that I was doing. He said, "Is there anything I can help you with?" And I was like, "You guys are about to tear down a really important building, the last of the big buildings, and I'd like to champion that building." And so, in a way, this started out as a kind of preservation effort. Preservation first, like we shouldn't tear it down, and then it's now evolving into a space where there are some archives. There are things here that are old that we reference.
Could you say something a little bit about why you didn't think the building should disappear? What was the cultural significance of this building in the neighborhood? Why did this one matter more than others?
Well, so now we have a strip mall that has a Pizza Hut and a Currency Exchange and a Walgreens and a Subway. That's okay. And there's an Auto Zone. Mm-hmm. And then beyond Auto Zone is a Save-A-Lot. And then beyond Save-A-Lot is a Walgreens that is no longer there. And this used to be a commercial strip with movie theaters and dining establishments and hardware stores and hotels and single residency occupancies, kind of gentlemen's hotels. And it just felt like I didn't like the architectural image. I didn't like the feeling that I had wanting to kind of get past Stony Island as fast as I could. And I also thought that the building, even though it had been abandoned for 30 years, had a lot more to offer the world standing than demolished. Right. And so, you know, it meant that we could have places to convene in this neighborhood, which we don't really have spaces like this. And so the space starts to make a lot of sense to me when it's filled up like this.
Right. And how beautiful that it used to be a bank, and for your project, which so much asks these critical questions about what do we value in our society and how do we rethink the value of art and community, it's like a lovely poetic sort of urgency to the fact that you saved a bank.
Yeah. I mean, for a minute, I was talking a lot, like when we were first starting to get into it, maybe we all talked about this.
Yeah, I came over very early.
This idea that there was a new kind of deposit or a kind of repository, and that it was a place where cultural legacy could live safely, mm-hmm. and then it could be kind of like, you know, I guess I shouldn't immediately get into money metaphors, but.
But let's also say that in the beginning, I mean, now everybody says, oh yeah, I remember going with Theaster and it was such a beautiful project, but pretty much everybody told you not to take this project on. Like, I mean, I remember sort of your best friends, like Hamza Walker, like donors, every single person said, this is a ridiculous project. I think it's sort of important to put that out there too,
Yeah, so we've been in the building now a couple years, and last night we had this amazing conversation with Thelma Golden, and she was saying that the Studio Museum was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and then another artist who was present last night said, no, when the Studio Museum started, it was actually above a liquor store. And that when we think about kind of histories of cultural spaces that matter, they don't always start occupying buildings that seem a certain kind of institution. And so I kind of like the idea that we started in a single story building, and now we have this building for the time that we have it, and we do the things we do in it. But it's not attempting to be a certain kind of institution. It wants to be kind of flexible and just kind of see what happens. And so, see y'all.
Could you talk a little bit about it as an object? I know one of our concerns tonight is about your making and your relationship to objects. And so, what is the amount of touch? There's not a lot of writing or talk about how you decide to intervene into a space in terms of the construction, or what to preserve, what to salvage, and how to move it and transform it.
Well, one way of thinking about it as an object is like, if we were to think about an architectural image, and like say what happens when people who have been driving by this building for a long time, and for those 30, 35 years, the building's been abandoned, and then to see construction happen, and then to see new windows in it. And like, there would be days when I'd be working on the building, and people would just slow down. And what I imagined was that cars would slow down as if they were looking at a painting. And so it was like, one way of like the objecthood was that it was like something happened to this object that made people imagine that they may want to stop again. Like that it's not a thoroughfare from 57th Street to the Skyway. This is like, from Hyde Park to your house in Michigan, right? It's your weekend house, but it's in fact a thing that could offer things along the way. And so I like that part. Once you get in the building, we made a lot of decisions about the voids. We wanted people to understand that the condition that the building is in today, where it's stable, the rain doesn't come in, the power works, the heat works most of the time, that this condition, like the building actually had a significant, like when we started, you could see through the roof because somebody had stolen the two skylights from the north part of the building and the south part, and then rain just kind of came through the building. So we wanted that to be evident. And then it was like, I didn't want to hide the fact that the building had age and decay. And so again, if there was a conversation around critical preservation, it had to do with the fact that maybe the Historic Preservation Council for the state of Illinois, the thing that they were preoccupied with was the wrong stuff. They were like, well, if you scratch the paint and you get to a color, then you can like repaint the whole thing that color. But then they made me like get really expensive windows because they imagined that those were the kinds of windows that would have existed in 1923. And I'm like, but don't we want to leave the wall the way it is? And then the windows that aren't there anymore, can't we just imagine what we want them at? And so it was like these moments where I was seriously engaged in a kind of policy, people's personal vocations and philosophies around preservation, and then my real building. And it's like, wait a minute, y'all were gonna tear the building down. So there was no active preservation. There's like no investment. It's like, well, if you're gonna invest in the building, then you gotta like get these other windows. And so it's like so I think that there's that, but then it's this idea of like, say, object like a vessel, like a ceramic object. The idea that the building is empty, and in its emptiness, it's potent. And that emptiness and that potency then, I'm not a Heidegger expert, but the bowl or the cup or the jar then is the thing that allows us to kind of potentially be together. That the thing is only interesting when the thing is pouring, when it's offering us grits, when you got some collard greens in the thing. And so again, it's like all the collard greens out here is
I'm just going to dive right in because earlier, and I think oftentimes, you want to insist on the importance of the object. And so I want to, one, just make sure everyone understands what kind of objects are also in here. But then I also want to move to this conversation which often informs, dare I use the word, social practice artists, art, or art forms, where people sort of feel like the beautiful object no longer really matters. But for you, the focus has always been and stays being on a sort of object, right?
Yeah, so I think this is worth us all, like I hope, I'm trying to have a conversation with us about things in this case. So, I have some slides here, I have some albums here. The albums belong to the Frankie Knuckles Foundation. They were Frankie Knuckles' personal albums. Sometimes he clubbed with those albums, but toward the end of his life, he did a lot of stuff with his computer, MIDIs, pre-recorded things. He was like freaking it. He was having a good time. But these albums, in some cases, they were already in the cases that like maybe the cases that he used for a night of clubbing. So it was like, it was super cool. So we have that stuff. We have Lyndon Johnson Rice's the Johnson Library. And in a way, I kind of built the building around this collection of 26,000 books. And so it was like, those things were the random things that kind of came to me over time. And my small buildings were too small to manage, and then not accommodating enough of a particular kind of public. And so the bank became an opportunity to house, let's call them collections. They're not archives yet. In all cases, they're other people's things, and there's a lot of it. And then it became an opportunity to think about, well, if these are just the University of Chicago's glass slides, they're banal. They're just a history of art that you could get on computer. Why would we preface the glass slide over another thing? And so it's like, well, I have personal interest in the analog. I have personal interest in young people and old people learning about images, and the more that we look at images, like the better our poetry is or something. Like there's like a way that images can inform how we understand ourselves in the world. And so I was like, well, these images, I don't want to just be excited about having glass slides. I would like to create an opportunity to platform those images, Ed Williams' collection, the books. And so I think that, so there's that, in that way, there's a commitment to material things.
Maybe slow that down for a little bit. Explain to us how those are, how do you share these with other people? So the space is this open vessel in a way, and it's to be filled, and it's filled with Ed Williams and with the Frankie Knuckles and with the Johnson publications and other things. And then what is that opportunity that you create for other people to take those in? So my team sends people through a library orientation. Once you go through the library orientation, you can use the books that are upstairs. It's not that those books are books that you can't find at Powell's bookstore. You can find them at Powell's bookstore, but these were John Johnson's books. And in that archive, that collection of things represents intention in collecting things over 50 years. And so part of this is like when the Poetry Foundation has an opportunity where they're reading from some of those things, or new poems have been made as a result of that collection, what we're doing is we're activating the archive, but we're also celebrating John Johnson in the Johnson Publishing Company. And it's like, that becomes a way more interesting memorial, like an action. The action becomes a more interesting memorial than the idea of creating an image of John Johnson. I would rather have a school of business and cultural entrepreneurship that's dedicated to John Johnson, so that we could perpetuate more people that would think about cultural images, cultural specificity, and then the platforms that matter or make sense, so that they can share those things with the world, let's say. But there's this other part of objecthood or material things
like say, what happens in a studio. And over the last couple of years, I've been just like thinking a lot about, say, my relationship to traditional African religion via the African fetish, a wooden reliquary object. And so it's like I'm thinking about these objects and I'm holding some of them and they're decaying in my hand. I can see wood debris, as if like 50 years from now, this thing that had meaning in a ceremony for a people, this thing may not exist anymore in this form. And so it's like, well, what happens if this thing that represents traditional African religion no longer exists and none of those objects no longer exist? And it's like, all we'll remember are big Catholic crosses. We'll think that in the beginning was the cross. We'll think that in the beginning was the cathedral. In the beginning was the cloak. And so it's like, and so I think that another kind of investment in material things has to do with like, it becomes a kind of link, not the only link, but a kind of link through which we could tell stories about the past and the future.
So maybe we should jump into the relation, how this relates to the Tamir Rice Pavilion. In some ways, you're bringing it here as an object, as a thing. It's meant to be engaged with in some way. How does that fit into this practice that you've been sharing with us and into other projects that you've been up to?
Right.
But first, could we also maybe hear a little bit about the genesis of the Tamir Rice and also a project and how it came to you?
So that, you know, brought it here and came to me. Those are things worth considering. So one night I get a text from this amazing artist, Hank Willis Thomas. And the text says, Samaria Rice is trying to get up with you. Tamir's bomb. Give her a call. Next day passes, he says, they need a home for the gazebo because it's about to get torn down. So you have this trauma of like no spaces for culture. And then you have this site where something horrific happens. And then what the city of Cleveland wants to do first is immediately eradicate any material sense of the thing so that people can no longer go to that place and mourn. They can't put teddy bears on the thing. They can't use it as an altar. And the quicker they can kind of erase that stuff, then people might forget the memory of the thing that happened there. And then that emotion that kind of festers as a result of being able to go back to that thing and mourn, they can kind of like squash that fester. So Samaria Rice went back and forth on whether or not she cared about the gazebo continuing to exist, because she didn't want to deal with the city handling the site, and it meant having a certain kind of capacity. Samaria and I had a conversation, and she was just like, we just need some help bringing the thing down.
So she didn't want it to be in Cleveland either?
She didn't want it to be in Cleveland because she didn't feel like the city of Cleveland, the city, so not black people in Cleveland, not the people who mourn, the administrative agency called the city of Cleveland. She didn't want it in Cleveland because the city of Cleveland didn't want the piece.
They had tried to find many people to sort of take it, like they'd gone to the Lonnie Bunch at the American Museum of African American History. He had wanted it, but also could not quite figure out how to display the gazebo. Yeah?
I mean, you know, it's worth saying that I don't really go looking for things. You know what I mean? Like, I don't go like, oh man, look, ooh, look that slave ship. You know, like, ooh, that is, you know what I mean? I don't go like, I mean, our African American Museum had to go look for things. It had to ask people for their things so that they could be the national repository of important black things. I get that. In this case, I got a call saying, we got to figure out what to do with this gazebo because the city of Cleveland, you know, and I was kind of like maybe the fifth caller. I don't know. You know, I was like, and so what seemed important first was that there would be a deinstall of the gazebo and that it would just be safely packaged so that Samaria could kind of think as heiress to this thing, what does she want to do with this and what is its relationship to her son's legacy? Yeah. And so my team went to Cleveland administrators, 2 builders, and then we worked with riggers in Cleveland to deinstall the piece, and we drove it back. And then it was like, oh wow, Tamir Rice's gazebo is in my studio.
Yeah.
And then it no longer felt like something that I could grapple with myself. So I was like, all right, it's in my studio for safekeeping. It is not a found set of materials for me to play with. It's not a trophy to be wielded. It was immediately like, I have to talk to the people on my team who know how to deal with trauma. I know how to deal with materials. I can deal with some aspects of material and trauma, but I know that there are a whole lot of people that got like other kinds of investments in Tamir, in the conversations about like police brutality, about black on black violence, about like the kind of systematic things that well up as a result of this world not giving a fuck about black boys.
Right.
Let's say.
So what's the the logistics? The piece is in Chicago right now in your studio.
Yeah.
And how long has it been here?
Maybe 4.5 months.
Okay. And so is it meant to land? Where is it going to land? When is it going to land?
We don't know. I mean, so Samaria's been out twice. She really talks to Amy on my team, and then there's a lawyer that's helping Samaria think about what to do with her national platform. Not just the gazebo. The gazebo is kind of like it's one of the ways that this material world insists that something bad happened somewhere, right? And so I said, Samaria, we want to, I was thinking half-mast. The conversation has been like, we're not going to resurrect the gazebo. I'm not rebuilding the gazebo. I'm just going to lay the pieces over there. And we're going to just store them there. And then whatever else you want to talk about, let's talk about it. Yeah. And so Samaria, she was like, no, I want the playground, I want the sand, I want the swing, and I was like, oh, well, what if I took a couple of the pieces of wood and did some? She's like, no, I don't really like that. Right? And so those moments where I was offering empathy, sympathy, support, and artistic advice, the thing she was interested in at least was my artistic advice. And because she had a sense of what that thing meant, and she had thought about it way more than me. And so I think that we're just kind of in this, we're trying to figure out what to do.
Right.
And because of the persistence of violence, because of the persistence of these traumas that end in death, there's a part of me that is kind of interested in what happens if the gazebo had a site here. I don't own the gazebo. Samaria doesn't know what she wants to do with it, but she's also talked about like moving it around the world. And so it's like all of a sudden this object is making us grapple with aesthetic ideologies. I'm thinking about histories of art. I'm thinking about histories of trauma and how trauma gets represented. And then I'm thinking about Samaria and the agency that she has as the mother of Tamir to kind of do what she want to do with the things that are connected to her son.
So how are you all negotiating that? Because one of the things that does stand out is the issue of translation or context for trauma. So how does a trauma and violence that takes place in one scene or context, whether that's spatial or temporal, 1960s to present, or in Cleveland to Chicago, how does that translate to the other site in the context? And then the idea of it sort of bumping all around the world is even, how does that trauma sort of ethically become a universal signifier of something that is very specific?
I don't know.
Yeah, so now I'm just wondering, so how,
I don't know.
no, I know, so how does one grapple? I'm just curious about
so let me start by saying, I don't know, but I know that Mrs. Till decided that she would leave the casket open.
We said we weren't going to talk about that.
I'm just saying, no, I'm not talking about her. I'm talking about, I'm talking about, like, I'm talking about this idea that people have agency.
Yeah, but it's also not such an unusual question, like how does Guernica become a symbol of militarism and violence when it's about a specific moment of time? I mean, artists and artworks have done that kind of signifying over and over again all the time. But I guess maybe the question is, do we need to see the gazebo as an artwork in order for it to do that work?
And I think the other question is getting it right. I think that's a question about,
So, to you both, the gazebo isn't an artwork. The gazebo's a gazebo, and there is no right. There's iteration. There's question. Like, say, when I say that I didn't have the ability to grapple by myself with the gazebo, I'm for real. So I was like, Quinna, Isis, how do we think about this? Right? I had to like immediately turn to my team because my team is more connected to folk who are more connected to Tamir. That in a way, it's not about the gazebo. It's about like this charged object that reminds people that really bad things happen in the world. And that there are people whose whole lives are dedicated to that. And my whole life is not dedicated to advocacy around the issue of trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right, yeah.
My life is dedicated to art.
Yeah.
But what the Tamir piece does is it allows us a moment where we could be like, oh, we don't really roll together. We don't sit at the same kitchen table or the same cafeteria table. But this thing, I have no choice but to really consider all these other people if we're gonna put this thing somewhere in these buildings. And in a way, I don't have to think about that when I'm making other works of art. So the Tamir piece made me have to, good art, good moves, has to do with like one's ability to say, I can't mess with that. I can't mess with that by myself. I can't mess with that on the terms of art. That is not about art. Like I say the best art is like, nah, Samara,
Yeah, but I would sort of maybe argue that Mrs. Rice actually wanted it in some way to be in the hands of an artist, right? Because there were other organizing groups that sort of said maybe it should be in Cleveland and do this work, or maybe, right? And there was a sort of sensibility that like, no, there's a kind of work that art can do that it can't do if it's just a historical monument, right? And I'll just quickly say that, in this public housing museum that I'm trying to open, the housing residents, they want a museum, right? They also want more public housing, but there's a sensibility that a museum can do a kind of work in society that is really important. And so, at one of the early gatherings, I was sitting in a group of activists, people who didn't really know your practice, but were thinking about violence, and somebody said, oh, Theaster is really into Japanese sort of history, he spent a lot of time there, and I remember hearing him talk once about a shrine that Japanese people rebuild and then reconstruct to teach sort of generations about the history of this space, and it's an important practice of transmitting knowledge between generations. Maybe the gazebo could be something like that, that we deconstruct and reconstruct together, all across the countries. Yes. And it was sort of that history which allowed people to think about the potentialities of what the gazebo could do, Absolutely. Which is different than, yes, there are tons of organizations who are doing important work around restorative justice, around ending state violence, that maybe they couldn't do if it
Yes.
wasn't an artwork.
So yes. So then two things. One is, let's say that Samaria felt good about the conversation. Like when we met, it felt good. So first it was like, and then she was like, well, you got to talk to my brother. You got to talk to my uncle. Like we had to make a phone call, and then he had to feel good about talking to me. But then when we started talking, it wasn't like I was like, first I'm gonna do this, then I'm gonna take the wood. I was like, I became a facilitator. I was like, so Samara, so how do you feel about this thing? And it's like, well, how do you feel about it being in Chicago? And I started asking all the questions that maybe a lot of us would ask, and I didn't immediately have moves, That's why the thing still ain't up, because it's a complicated, loaded object. You can't just go messing with it. Right, so there's that part, but then there's the other piece that's like, part of what would make the Issei Shrine in Japan make sense is that somebody has to say, this is the reason why we construct and deconstruct and reconstruct this thing. That there's a part of it that's like about the labor and the physicality and the object. And then there's this other part that's about grounding it in the context, right? So when I'm being weirdo, abstract, conceptual artist dude, I don't necessarily feel like I gotta tell somebody why I'm making a move. If you're reconstructing and deconstructing Tamir Rice's gazebo, you're not making abstract, weird, random art dude moves. It has to be a whole other set of considerations that are different from one's regular engagement in what would be some kind of conventional art world. And the reason I feel like I'm making this point to all of us is that whatever the thing is that brought us here today, we all do different shit. And it's like the way that we imagine ourselves being birthed in the world, called in the world, tied to our beliefs, tied to our causes, makers and shapers of things or not, that all of that stuff is like, well, there is no one kind of artistic practice that would allow me to take Ed Williams things and say, oh, I always have this kind of dissemination tactic. And then I take the Johnson things and I always have this dissemination tactic. And then I take the Tamir Rice and it's like, oh, I'm gonna put it out there and then I'm gonna cut it up and sell parts of it through YQ? What the fuck? It's like, I'm not that dude, right? And so there's a part of it that requires deep and gross consideration, project to project, context making, project to project, even the choice to like not have a didactic on the wall and to say, we don't explain what that is, we just play house music out of it. If you read the thing, then maybe you get some sense of it. Ain't no title that says who made the thing, but when we come in this building, we want people to feel Frankie Knuckles. That's all that really matters, is the spirit of Frankie Knuckles. We got a big speaker for Frankie Knuckles.
I think that's a really helpful explanation of how you come to select the collections, not archives, the collections that you take on. What I mean by that is I've never had a good handle, and I've written about this a little bit, of what things that, what you might say no to, right? So I know that the Ed Williams collection, they came to you to some extent. It sounds like Hank and Samira, the family, came to you to some extent. But can you share with us maybe an anecdote or an example of a situation where you've not decided to take on the project for some of the reasons that you're talking about, that you don't feel that connection and that ability to take on the challenge?
Yeah, so often what happens is like, let me say first why I say yes to things. And then, so Ed Williams had also, so Ed Williams is his black Chinese brother from Mississippi. He has really good hair. He could pass at a time when passing was a thing. And he ended up becoming one of Chicago's kind of most formidable like black bankers. But he didn't look black, and that kind of was a thing for Ed, for Ed history. So when Ed would travel, he would see these little tchotchkes at like little thrift shops and stuff. And he kind of committed himself to removing those tchotchkes from the world. So he ended up with like 6,500 objects. He's 72 now. He was going to give them to his family. Those objects are objects of trauma. He has like 49 Aunt Jemima figurines, Harper's Bazaar lynching tombs, all kinds of negrobilia. And his children did not want that stuff near their children. Those were not the images that they wanted reinforced. In a way, that was a kind of trauma for Ed, that he had the burden of a legacy that his children didn't want. And so he had been talking to people and attempting to sell them. He thought about selling parts on eBay, setting up a small business, and then it was like that stuff was gonna get dispersed and disseminated. And I was like, I can't, it's not gonna stop. Where am I gonna put this shit? And it was like after the third conversation of meeting Ed, then it became relational. Then it was like, oh, Ed's super dope. Oh, dang. These things shouldn't be dispersed. He spent 45 years collecting them. Oh, wow, I really understand that his daughter doesn't want this stuff, right? And it was like the more I got to know Ed, the more invested I became in these things, which Negrobilia is passé. You were writing about those things in the 90s, right? No offense, no offense.
When she was 10, yeah.
She was 12, right? And so it was like, so then it was like, well, if these things were situated here, how might these things help us grapple with, they could be a bookend of racial stereotype. And then the Johnson stuff could be the other bookend of black progress, of a new black image. And that maybe in a place like this, I could kind of grapple with those two extremes, and then find myself in a center for images, an institute for the reflection of. We can look at stuff.
No, it's a nice complementarity.
Yeah,
All right, so then can I go back to this thing, which I know you don't want to, but like, so you all, Theaster does not identify as a social practitioner. Just let us get that out there.
Say that now,
Right,
halfway through.
refuses to sort of say that that's what he does. But it's okay, I'm not, whatever. But I'm just saying, but can we say though, could we say then that you practice a relational art? Like, which is another term which is sort of out there.
So
I know that you don't want to name it, and I have an important desire to name the practice and the genre, but I just want to sort of ask you.
Let's talk about this together. Why would I resist a label when I feel like art is big enough? So I feel like art is big enough. I'm an artist. And sometimes I go back to Gordon Matta Clark's Rockefeller application right before he died. That Matta Clark had gotten to this moment where he was making his cuts, he was doing his demolition work, he had his company, he had his stardom by 32. And then in this Rockefeller proposal, he was starting to get to the point where he was like, well, there are all these men and women who help me do these things when I do them in New Jersey, around town, Long Island City. And like maybe there's a way that I could potentially include them in one of my shows or something. Maybe there's a way that I could offer some new kind of resource, right? And what was happening within his art practice, there was no name for this other thing that was starting to happen. What started to happen was that he started to, via the life work within his artistic practice, he started to more deeply consider other people. That in this thing that was completely self-absorbed, hugely egocentric, absolutely autonomous and island-like, he was starting to have this moment where like, oh wow, maybe I should name other people in the work that I'm doing. Maybe there's something else discursive that really needs to happen. And I think that in the evolution of an artistic practice, one could say, I've been working with people for 30 years, and you know what? I'm ready to just go to my studio and make beads, make necklaces, right? And I get that, and that artists have the right to, right? So the resistance isn't because I think that the label isn't a worthy label. What I'm trying to do is suggest that there's a way that art for me has something to do first with an aesthetic experience, a material experience, a heart experience, maybe something slightly spiritual. And that if I commit to those things, I'm not just committed to people, I'm committed to people being sexy as fuck. I'm not just committed to buildings and the functionality of a building. I'm interested in the way a building might say something about itself as a result of how I build it and who visits. And so it's like, so that if the term, please have grace with me, that if the term social practitioner means that there's an absolute predetermination about a lane that one wants to live in, that ain't what I was born into. I was born into something else, and it happens that a big part of my time in my life is super interested in other people. And some of that stuff is worth writing a grant application for, and some of it ain't about a grant application. It ain't about a museum experience. It's just about the kind of relationship that I want to have with people.
Yeah. Have you been clear about that the whole time, or is this something that you're sort of, because you speak with this with great clarity tonight. So is this something that you feel more confident about at this moment, Theaster, or have there been other periods in the trajectory of what you've been up to where you would embrace the term and you felt like you were really there in it, with it, and now you're willing to kind of think about it as in terms of a more expansionist practice?
No, you never.
No.
You never
mean,
liked the term.
He always hated
So
it. Yeah.
I think you always hated the term.
last
but,
night,
yeah.
I'm gonna keep sidestepping the term. Last night I was telling Thelma Golden that when I moved to Dorchester, 6918, it was a two-bedroom house. It was about 1,700 square feet. It used to be a candy store. The candy store was in the front, and that's where my studio was, where I would read. And it was 2 bedrooms. I decided that I would have a residency in my 2-bedroom house, and that the 2nd bedroom would be the residency. And then, I had just got my job at the university. I would buy groceries, and then we would just share the groceries. So it was like, I didn't call that anything, right? I didn't need to call it anything. But the reason one might call it a residency is because then one might be able to go to Choice Foundation and say, I have a residency, it's a 1-room residency, and I want $50,000 to support an artist who would live with me, and we share our food. So that's the kind of economics of naming, right? Or I could say, man, I've been trying to make these paintings all my life, and then as soon as I open up my 2nd bedroom, the Chicago Tribune starts writing about the fact that I have this thing, and so maybe I should just lean into that. But like, life happens, and that there isn't clarity, there's stumble. It's like, oh, and then I just realized, like, oh, I really like living around people, or I really like living around certain people. I don't like living around everybody. I've learned. I actually don't like everybody. I like certain people.
Right. But could we imagine? I know, I'm like, whatever, shut up. No, but the thing is this, but honestly, I mean, for me, I don't need to go to the mat for the term, but what I want to go to the mat for is the importance for us as practitioners, as people in a community, sort of saying, like, I want to say Black Lives Matter. I don't want to say all human lives matter. I want to identify as a feminist because it means something. And could we imagine that sort of the name of social practitioner or social practice could be something deeply emancipatory? It could be a mode of critique of institutions that we're working against. It could be a way of naming community, and of sort of sharing a sort of set of values, which could be actually completely not a constraint and not a way of disciplining artists, but actually a way of building something new.
Yes. Okay.
So,
We can move on.
We can move on.
No, but listen, we have to stay here for a minute.
Yeah.
So there are moments when you and I talk, and we're talking about the fact that there's not affordable housing for all people, and we still have homelessness. Or we say there are no venues for certain things. I'm trying to think, one of these conversations we had, and you were like, well, Theaster, that's not just like an artistic right, that's a human right. And the thing that you were doing is you were trying to take a very specific idea of, like, let's say, the lack of housing, and then say Black and brown communities, let's say. So you were taking this really specific thing around the lack of housing in Black and brown, and then you were using this broad subject that would hit home with people around the notion of human rights. And that like when we take this really specific thing and we talk about it in terms of human rights, who could say no to the fact that everybody deserves a place to live? That's right, let's say. Flip side of that is, I believe that a full artistic life would include relational practices, would include the social. I would imagine that within the MFA program, we would be teaching people, like doctors needing to take a class on how to talk to a person when they say, you have cancer. You can't just walk up to somebody and be like, you know what, I'm sorry, you know what I mean? And so it's like those moments where in order to actually perfect the field, let's say the field of art, big A, you need more than 2 years. You need more than studio classes. That in fact, instead of being a silo over in the arts conservatory, and the humanities are over there, and the sciences are over there, the life sciences over there, physics is over there, it's like, don't we imagine that we would like to make our own pigments? And don't we imagine that we would have wanted some kind of conflict resolution class so that as we're negotiating contracts with the museum or sugar with our neighbor, that we would have tools. And so maybe part of what I'm suggesting and that maybe we agree on is that absolutely there should be a wedge inside of art that says, I'm not interested in all that other stuff, I'm actually interested in this road. I'm with you on that. I also think that art has more of a responsibility to say, shouldn't we all be interested in this road?
I mean, another way of thinking about it is that if you work in both domains, one that is kind of verges towards social practice and one that does other things, you're also, and maybe it's more of a question, Theaster, how are you able to sort of critique both? So you can also offer an interesting, critique of social practice because you have this other purview, and then you can do the same in the other direction as well. Because you're kind of open to claiming it sometimes and then also disclaiming it.
I went to a protest with an English teacher. We were walking through the grounds. My friend, the English teacher, noticed that there was an apostrophe where it shouldn't have been. She was mortified because she felt if you're going to care enough about the cause, you should know how to write it out if you're going to write.
Right, let's...
I'm making a point,
Yeah.
right? For the English teacher, what she was preoccupied with was like right spelling and apostrophes. And she was able to critique that part of the protest, and it almost consumed her, and she forgot the cause. And I think that in some ways for me, I want to be able to say the foot of that bowl is a good foot. The wall of the bowl is consistent and even. It's lighter than I need it to be for chili, because chili is heavy, and that those responses are a potter's critique of good ceramics. And I want to be able to do that in the spirit of craftsmanship around clay. For a conceptual artist who thinks that they're working within the realms of conceptual practices, if they think that their meter is the history of conceptual art, then there should be people that are ready that there should be a way of saying that actually sucks. And to your question about rightness and wrongness, well, could an activist ever be wrong because one chooses activism? Is there ever a wrong way to activate? Yeah. Yes! and that what we would hope is that in love and grace, we would become better and better humans, and that the things that we believe in and the things that we want to fight for, that we would become more and more thoughtful in that fight. And so I've made bad art. I've made bad administrative decisions. I've made bad financial decisions and bad love decisions. But I think that my hope is that because I know that the bank building is a building that is iterative, because it was born to change, that what I hope is that from one glory to the next, it would be a better thing as time goes on, is what I would hope.
Yeah, so that evolution within the practice is really sort of key and important. Yeah, so I think that's...
And that a person who might identify as one thing today,
Right.
10 years from now, may identify as something else, but the experiences of this day inform who we are. And I think that's awesome. I don't know.
I know, I can't tell how much to resist. Well, it's only because, but to me there is a categorical difference then between certain forms of art in which they're finished, right? I mean, there's sort of, yes, there's always the reception of them, but then there's a different kind of durational practice to both social change and to social practice and to sort of a certain kind of socially engaged art,
Yes.
which I think creates different sets of questions,
Yes.
and as somebody who runs an art school, it creates a different sets of necessities for teaching, for pedagogy, and for value. And so, but I think we do actually agree more than we disagree. That's my, let's end this part and go to the next one.
So Lisa, let me just, maybe for the sake of, for this room, talk about some of the things that I struggle with.
Yeah.
So I wear 3 hats. One is I have a studio practice. I have a 501c3 that I run and founded, and I work at the University of Chicago. In all 3 cases, I build buildings. Buildings are a means to an end of creating cultural opportunities for myself first and others. Okay? When I moved to this neighborhood 11 years ago from the west side of Chicago, people were not excited about living here in general. People who were in my life who lived here and people who were in my life who didn't want me to move here were not excited about the move. So I did it. 2008, so that was 2006. 2008 happens, people lose their homes. Slumlords lose their business of owning homes that they're slumlords of. The neighbor, 82%, 75 to 82% of my blocks between 67th and 71st, don't nobody live there, and people are still in all the copper pipes. Don't nobody live there. It's like, it's blighted. It's lesser used. It's rumored to be one of the most violent places in the city, if not the country. And people told me to move. In that moment, nobody said, Theaster, you're gentrifying the neighborhood. Theaster, your presence as an artist there is going to create some. We get the bank, we rehab the bank. And it's like there are these moments where I feel like deep care and enthusiasm, say in this case for me, for space. And that space would be the arbiter for allowing amazing cultural things to happen. They say the way that I build my spaces is different than the way that I build space for the University of Chicago. But I think that there's also a way in which when people see a building like this, they're like, what white people funded it? Right? And it's immediately like, oh. And so these moments where I'm trying to figure out how can I simply get people excited about visiting me in my neighborhood again? How could I get the people who live next door to me to just continue to want to live next door so that they copper pipes, they leaky water don't run in my basement? I need them to stay because I just want my basement to be dry. And it's like, how do you go from 10 years where it's like total flight, disbelief, no interest, to this next move that's like kind of stabilization? Maybe something's on its way. Maybe something is possible. To this next level where it's like, your presence in the neighborhood seems to function as a kind of threat to the possibility of black regeneration ever happening because white people are coming. Right?
But that, I mean, yes, and I agree with you there. I mean, I saw a beautiful conversation between Amanda Williams and Janet Smith, who runs the Voorhees Center, who edited a wonderful book called Where Are the Poor People to Live? And she sort of said the biggest mistake is that we sort of see artists as the gentrifiers, where artists are not the gentrifiers, they are a symptom of gentrification. Gentrification is caused by racism, capitalism, the militarism of our societies, and it's not artists, but artists definitely reflect and also amplify the gentrification that is to come.
Artists can also intervene into that in
they
more
can,
productive ways. as well.
And
Yeah,
we
yeah.
potentially can intervene,
Right.
right?
Let me share with you guys another kind of story. When I moved to my neighborhood, and things were going on, there's this federal grant called Hope 6. Hope 6 was like a kind of neighborhood stabilization mechanism where the federal government would give money to developers to buy up. They would give them the building and then give them money per unit to make spaces for low-income people, low-income housing residents, or folk who needed affordable housing. When I would look at the map of my neighborhood, all of these buildings were either owned by portfolios, and when I moved there, they were owned by portfolios in Phoenix or like Vermont or somewhere, or they were owned by companies like LKD Logistics, 123 Outsourcing Services, the Miami Land Trust, right? There were all these things. It was like the neighborhood, though blighted, was already all white owned years before I moved here. But what my presence did was all of those things that are invisible, that people don't understand, they don't know where to look under the MLS or the MLA, they don't know that what I did was I became an openly engaged, open voice, open sourced, open financial book, open mouthed person, trying to make sense of the complexities of urban cities as I was figuring things out. It was like what they would say about black kids at the Art Institute. I would go to school for a day, and then I would come home and be like, this is what I learned today. Perspective means this. And so as I was learning urban form, neighborhood transformation, I was sharing it at TED. That's just what I did, right? And what that did was it made me a kind of the only one announcing the work that they were doing. Then they announced the Obama Center. When they announced the Obama Center, all these people that already owned land, there was like a swell. There was like a, ooh, right? And then all of a sudden there were these new meetings.
Yeah. Does everybody know that Obama Presidential Library is going in just down the street from there? Yeah.
Right? And so I went from being dumb for living at 69th and Dorchester to being considered a real estate mogul and genius and gentrifier. And that it's okay for the mayor to announce that they're going to give $35 million to a golf course. That there's no protest against the mayor for giving $35 million to a golf course. And that as soon as they say that Tiger Woods is going to build a golf course, there are people talking about hotels on Stony Island.
Right, but that sort of proves the point than contradicts it, I guess. I mean, because black capitalism isn't actually an effective sort of counter to gentrification.
Yeah.
And I think also if we're thinking in terms of being just and ethical, it doesn't mean that sort of one form of this, forecloses the other.
That's right.
So and that's sort of how, it's been really great at a lot of the other convenings over the last 2 days. People have really taken on the concept and topic of justice. And so I think one of the things that's really important to mention is that you do have to be really sort of strategic and tactical in how you are combating it, because
Absolutely.
it doesn't mean that sort of white injustice or black injustice, that one is sort of easier and more palatable than the other. They're both
Yeah.
injustices. And
But
so,
I mean, I think, but that's where we have to talk about strategy, so that like I could own the bank and the land next to the bank because nobody wanted to own it, and then I could entrust the bank and the land next to the bank, so that the mission of this thing always carries something that, as the rest of the neighborhood changes, because things change, that there's actually 72 units of housing that'll always be affordable and for people of color, because I was smart enough to like ensure that the thing that I believe in, that I could put my money down on. And that the thing that, like when we talk about collective economics and like the possibility of a collective, it's like, what does that mean? Does that mean y'all really gonna take your $5 and your $5 and put it together and start a building cooperative? It's like, most of the people, I was like, yo man, there's an empty, come live next door to me. They were like, man, are you freaking crazy? I'm moving to Wicker Park. I'm getting me an apartment in Pilsen.
Yeah. But I also think, though, that to distinguish between sort of tactics and strategy, right? I mean, that's sort of important understanding that there are deep systems of power in place, which you, as a black male artist on the South Side, cannot just disrupt and aren't necessarily the cause or the effect of. I mean, it's that you can have many tactics, but until we collectively actually have a critique of capitalism, of white supremacy, it's not as if Theaster, the artist, somehow is going to be able to sort of, wholesalely create a South Side which is not gentrified, not X, Y, and Z. I mean, not to take away their power as an artist. I'm just saying that I think it's important because I think often the critiques of you mistake sort of the power of a single artist who happens to be in the press a lot, right?
But maybe, Lisa, the point I'm also making is, like, if we go back to the counterpoints into social practice, the truth is, I don't have an art degree, I have a planning degree. And so part of the reason that we're in this fucking bank is that I actually know how financing works. And it's like financing is racist. But what financing wants to know is that somebody can pay the rent if I give you a loan. And so people who went to school for financing knew that they could lie about the people paying the rent. We just didn't know we could lie, so we were always telling the truth, like, oh, I make $1,000 a month, but sometimes I don't. And if I get tips, then right? But other people were like, no, we can get $5,000 a month for that, 200 square feet, And it was like, and they come to and so that's where the systemic racism is that we actually would imagine that I would never take a business school class because that's for white capitalist people. And as a result, we end up boxing ourselves out of the ability to actually manage the things that we love and care the most about. And I'm just saying, sometimes we need to know a little bit more than like how to make a fucking pot.
So on that note, and because we,
We're going to do 10 minutes.
For a few
I think
questions.
Jen wants to do 10 minutes of Q&A.
Q&A.
Is that okay?
All right.
What Jen wants, she gets.
This is awesome.
I was going to say, what excites you about social practice?
Are there any burning questions? Do I see a
gonna ask you
hand?
that. But you must. Oh, you do have one over there.
Hi. You mentioned at the beginning that this venue is a place for the neighborhood to gather, that they needed that. I was just curious about what kind of things the neighborhood do within the building, what it's used for, and what happens here.
Free Wi-Fi.
Very important.
I
know, it
we
is,
look at
right?
books. We look at books. We listen to music. People come here and have meetings without announcing themselves. They just have a kind of slightly more formal space where they can have conversations. There's lots of nooks, and so people read. It's like a reading space. And then we sometimes have big talks. Sometimes we dance. It's a little bit like an event space with an archive and a reading room.
There's been
And then-
community yoga classes
Yeah,
here.
we do things, and this building doesn't have to do all things because there's a couple other buildings that do other things. But every Friday we have been screening films under the banner Black Cinema House, and those films also have a conversation with the impeccable Dr. Jackie Stewart and Miss Sabrina, who's maybe up in the corner somewhere. Sometimes we teach film education and kind of teach people how to make their own films. Some of those people record events that happen here and edit them. We have fun in general, sometimes.
We are going to have fun tonight, and we're going to dance, but are there any last questions before we transition? Okay.
Very good, very well done.
I see you.
Jen, there's one hand here and there's one hand there. Do we have time
I'll
for
make
that?
my way to both.
Yeah.
I'll be shorter.
I was just wondering, you were talking about the vision of art being on a campus and there being all the other, like the humanities and the sciences and the relationship between them, but you were also talking about art sort of maintaining its shape as art rather than being called social practice or something like that. And I was just wondering whether the name art or the discipline art is the thing that we're standing for, or is it the change in society that we're standing for? And obviously we don't all have the same answer.
Right on. I think this question is great, but it has a lot to do with like where we enter. So let's say that you entered thinking about change, and I enter having grown up using crayons and liking to dress really flamboyant. That I may eventually get to the possibility of change being important to me, and that change might happen through my crayons and my fashion, where you might enter through the idea of change with no ambition for the aesthetic, and then we might meet each other and you might, oh, I love your fashion, maybe my change and your fashion together, and we could change fashion, you know? And that idea of kind of, I'm not making a judgment about who we are or where we start. I'm just saying that like, it's amazing when a biologist decides to be an architect. Or when a person who's dedicated their lives to causes feels like, man, I can only really do what I want to do if I also learn French. And that there are these moments where the thing you believe in should compel you to continue to grow and grow and grow the things that you know, so that you can be a more useful conduit, tool, person, human in the world. That I'm not actually saying, when I do this, I mean that I don't want art to be like this. I'm saying that art, in a way, I'm not making a pyramid, I'm trying to demonstrate a fan that's kind of upside down. That art should have the capacity to encompass whatever you want that thing, you know, but also one who believes in change should also feel as if the investment in change is also accordion and broad.
Right here. How does your investment in spirituality relate to tonight's conversation?
Well, so I thought that I would preach and that I would have a kind of conventional, I would allow my knowledge of regional planning to have an office inside of the church. And because I thought that maybe the church was the best vehicle for me to be a part of neighborhood transformation and ethics and people. That it was a kind of pre-made platform, it was ready-made, and I could just add my skill set and we could build things for the poor and we could commit to the tenants. And well, I thought that the church would be a lot less judgmental than the art world. But in fact, they're equally judgmental. And so I at different frequencies. And so, but I think that my sense of, having like early on, because of religion, I had to ask myself a lot. It made me ask myself a lot, what do I think that I'm on earth for? Or how do I think I could best be of service? And I think that those things they kind of transferred over. And while I don't actively practice, I have a band called the Black Monks of Mississippi. And that band, oh my God. Thank you guys very much. Thank